It is an image that has been etched into the consciousness of Western civilization for 3,000 years, a colossal wooden horse standing silent and imposing on a deserted beach. Imagine the scene. For 10 long years, the Trojans have lived behind their impregnable walls, staring out at the endless camp of their Achaean besiegers. They have endured plagues, sieges, and the clash of heroic armies. Then, one morning, they wake to an impossible sight. The Greek ships are gone. Their sprawling camp is empty, the shoreline littered with the debris of a decade of war. And in the center of it all, left as a supposed offering to the gods, is the horse. A monument of profound strangeness, both a surrender and a riddle. This single object, the Trojan horse, has become the ultimate symbol of deception. It is the story of a war won not by strength, but by cunning. Yet, it is also the gateway to a much larger and more profound question. A question that historians and archaeologists have wrestled with for centuries. Did any of it truly happen? Was there ever a great city of Troy? Did a coalition of Greek kings truly wage a 10-year war over a beautiful queen? Or is this epic, which stands at the very dawn of Western literature, nothing more than a foundational myth, a brilliant fiction designed to explain the world and the violent passions of its gods and men? Welcome to Ancient History Concepts channel. In this complete narration video, we will journey together into the heart of that very question. Our purpose here is not simply to retell the famous story of the Trojan War, but to explore its fascinating dual identity. We will treat this tale with the respect it deserves, following the grand narrative passed down to us by ancient poets like Homer, whose epic poem, the Iliad, remains one of the most influential works ever created. We will analyze the pride of Achilles, the nobility of Hector, and the meddling of the Olympian gods. But we will also go deeper, peeling back the layers of mythology to examine the world from which this story emerged. We will act as historical detectives, shifting our focus from the poetic verse to the archaeological dig site. We will explore the historical realities of the Late Bronze Age, a turbulent, highly interconnected period of powerful empires and magnificent palaces. We will look at the physical evidence for the city of Troy, the site known today as Hisarlık in modern-day Turkey, and ask what the silent stones and layers of destruction can tell us about the world of the Mycenaean Greeks and their powerful neighbours, the Hittites. This is a story of both myth and history, and to truly understand it, we must give each its proper due. To navigate this epic landscape, our exploration will be divided into 3 distinct parts. First, we will investigate the seeds of the conflict, tracing the story back to its mythological origins, a divine beauty contest, a fateful judgment, and the abduction of the most beautiful woman in the world. But we will also ground this tale in reality, exploring the political tensions and cultural values of the Bronze Age that could make such a war conceivable. Second, we will immerse ourselves in the war itself, a brutal 10-year struggle defined by the rage of heroes, the despair of the besieged, and the ever-present intervention of the gods. This section will cover the core narrative of the Iliad, from the wrath of Achilles to the tragic duel with Hector, and of course, the final, decisive stratagem of the Trojan horse. And finally, we will confront the aftermath, a victory that felt more like a curse. We will follow the difficult and often tragic homecomings of the Greek heroes and witness the utter destruction of Troy. Crucially, we will connect this legendary catastrophe to a very real historical event, the mysterious and violent collapse of the entire Bronze Age civilization. The Trojan War is the ultimate story of glory and tragedy, of human passion and divine will. It is a tale that has been told and retold for millennia, yet it has lost none of its power. So now, let us begin our journey. Our story starts not on a bloody battlefield, but at a glittering wedding, where a single, uninvited guest would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the ruin of a civilization. But before we proceed further, please like the video and subscribe. It means a lot, and it helps the channel grow. Thank you. Every great fire begins with a single spark. For the Trojan War, that spark was not struck by mortal hands on a battlefield. It was struck at a wedding feast, amidst the celebrations of gods and heroes. The event was the marriage of Peleus, a respected mortal king, to Thetis, a beautiful and enchanting sea nymph. It was a rare and joyous occasion, a symbolic union of the mortal and immortal realms held high on Mount Pelion, attended by nearly all the gods of Olympus. It was meant to be a moment of perfect harmony, a testament to the order of the cosmos. But in a world governed by pride and passion, perfect harmony is a fragile state, and it was about to be shattered. There was one deity who had been deliberately excluded from the guest list, Eris, the goddess of discord. Her very nature was antithetical to a celebration of unity. She was the personification of strife, envy, and rivalry, a divine agent of chaos who thrived where order frayed. To be snubbed from such a prominent gathering was a deep insult, and Eris was not one to suffer a slight in silence. She arrived at the feast unannounced, a spectre of resentment at the edge of the festivities. She did not need to draw a sword or shout a curse to sow her chaos. Her weapon was far more subtle and far more devastating. It was a single perfect golden apple taken from the mythical garden of the Hesperides. On its polished skin was a single word, Callistae, for the fairest. Eris rolled the apple into the center of the divine assembly, and in that moment, the joyous atmosphere curdled. The inscription was a masterpiece of malice, for it did not name a recipient. It was a loaded question posed to a room full of beings defined by their power and their pride. Who was the fairest? Immediately the claim was made by three of the most powerful goddesses in the Olympian pantheon. First was Hera, the majestic and often jealous queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, for whom being the fairest was a matter of royal right. Second was Athena, the formidable goddess of wisdom, strategy, and warfare, born fully formed from the head of Zeus. For her, being the fairest was an affirmation of her supreme status. And third was Aphrodite, the captivating goddess of love, beauty, and desire, who had been born from the sea foam and whose entire domain was beauty itself. The dispute was immediate and intense. The fate of the world hung in the balance of a divine argument rooted in vanity. The other gods wisely refused to offer an opinion, knowing that to choose one would be to earn the eternal enmity of the other two. The decision fell, as it so often did, to Zeus, king of the gods. But even he recoiled from the choice. To declare his own wife the most beautiful might seem like favoritism, but to choose another would invite a wrath no man or god would ever want to face. In a masterstroke of political maneuvering and responsibility shirking, Zeus declared that no god could fairly judge such a matter. A mortal must decide. His chosen judge was a young man named Paris, a prince of Troy who, due to a prophecy that he would be the downfall of his city, was living in rustic exile as a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida. It was there that the divine procession found him, as Hermes, the messenger god, descended from the heavens to present the shepherd prince with his impossible task. Imagine the terror and awe of that moment. A mortal tending his flock, suddenly confronted by the dazzling, terrifying, and barely concealed power of three rival goddesses. He was asked to be the arbiter of a beauty that could launch wars and topple mountains. But this was not merely a beauty contest. It was a negotiation. Each goddess, recognizing that the judgment of a mortal could be swayed, set about bribing the judge. Hera went first, offering him what a queen would offer: power. She promised to make him the king of all Europe and Asia, a ruler with untold wealth and dominion over millions. It was an appeal to worldly ambition. Athena followed, offering what a warrior goddess would offer: glory. She promised him victory in every battle he would ever fight, and wisdom that would make him renowned throughout the world. It was an appeal to heroic legacy. Finally, it was Aphrodite's turn. She had no empires or victories to offer. Her bribe was simpler and far more aligned with the heart of a young man. She promised him the love and possession of the most beautiful mortal woman in the entire world, Helen of Sparta. Paris, a young man driven more by passion than by a thirst for power or glory, made his choice. He awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite. In that single act, he secured the goddess of love as his divine patron, but he also sealed his fate. He had mortally offended Hera, the queen of heaven, and Athena, the goddess of war. He had judged the divine on mortal terms, and in doing so, had made two of the most powerful forces in the cosmos his implacable enemies. The judgment on Mount Ida was over, but its consequences were just beginning. The promise made to a shepherd prince would now have to be kept, and its fulfillment would require the breaking of oaths, the violation of kingdoms, and the gathering of 1,000 ships. The divine prologue was complete, and the stage was now set for the mortal crime. The judgment on Mount Ida was a divine affair, a secret pact made between a goddess and a shepherd. But promises made by gods to mortals have a tendency to bleed into the world, to demand a price in blood and treasure. The object of Aphrodite's promise, the reward for Paris's fateful choice, was not a mere abstraction. She was a woman of flesh and blood, a queen whose beauty was said to be without parallel. Her name was Helen, and she was the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Helen was no ordinary queen. In the mythological landscape of ancient Greece, lineage was paramount, and Helen's was the most extraordinary of all. She was said to be the daughter of Zeus himself, who had come to her mother Leda in the guise of a swan. This divine parentage set her apart, imbuing her with a beauty that seemed more than human, and making her the ultimate political prize in the Achaean world. Her marriage to Menelaus was the bedrock of his reign, a union that solidified his power and prestige among the Greek kings. She was not merely his wife, she was the living symbol of his status and his honor. Into this stable, powerful Spartan court, a ship from Troy arrived on a supposed diplomatic mission. At its head was the Prince Paris, now restored to his royal position in Troy, no longer a humble shepherd, but a handsome and charming emissary from a wealthy eastern kingdom. He was acting as the agent of Aphrodite, coming to claim his promised reward. As a visiting prince, Paris was welcomed into Menelaus's palace and placed under his protection. This was not a matter of simple courtesy. It was a sacred and binding social contract known as xania, or guest friendship. Xenia was the bedrock of order in the ancient world. It was a set of obligations, protected by Zeus himself, that bound host and guest in a reciprocal bond of trust and protection. The host had to offer shelter, food, and safety to the traveller, regardless of their origin. The guest, in turn, had a sacred duty not to harm or dishonour their host or his household in any way. This code was the foundation of all diplomacy, trade, and safe travel. To violate xenia was not just a personal betrayal. It was a sacrilegious act, an offence against the gods, and a direct challenge to the fundamental order of civilization. Menelaus, as a good king, fulfilled his duty perfectly. He welcomed Paris with feasts and honours, treating him with all the respect due to his station. Then, trusting that his guest would abide by this sacred code, Menelaus was called away to attend the funeral of his grandfather in Crete. He left Paris in his home, a guest with full access to his palace and his family. It was a fatal miscalculation, a moment of vulnerability that Paris, driven by divine promise and personal desire, immediately exploited. The ancient sources are divided on what happened next. Some poets portray Helen as a willing participant, a woman swept away by the dashing Trojan prince, choosing passion over her duty. Others depict her as a tragic victim, abducted against her will, a pawn in a game played by gods and men. But whether she was seduced or seized, the result was the same. Paris fled Sparta, and he did not go alone. He took Helen with him, and to compound the crime, he also plundered Menelaus's treasury, stealing a vast quantity of gold and silver. This act transformed the transgression from a crime of passion into an act of state-sponsored piracy. The Duel violation was catastrophic. Paris had not just stolen a woman, he had stolen a queen, the daughter of a god, from another king's home. He had broken the sacred bond of xenia in the most profound way imaginable, abusing his host's protection to steal from his household. He had publicly and grotesquely dishonored Menelaus, questioning his power, his authority, and his manhood in front of the entire world. When Menelaus returned to Sparta, he came home to an empty bed and a looted treasury. His personal grief at the betrayal was surely immense, but it was instantly eclipsed by the public outrage. The insult was too great to be ignored. An attack on the honor of one king was an attack on the stability of all kingdoms. If a guest could so brazenly violate the sanctity of a host's home and escape unpunished, then no king was safe, no alliance was secure, and the entire edifice of diplomacy and trust would crumble. The crime was mortal, but the insult demanded a response of an entirely different scale. Menelaus's personal quest for justice was about to become a national cause for war, and he had a powerful tool at his disposal to ensure he would not fight alone. The dishonor of Menelaus was not an insult he had to bear alone. His righteous fury was amplified by the power of his older brother Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler in all of Greece. But even Agamemnon's might would not be enough. To challenge the great city of Troy, they would need an army unlike any the world had ever seen. Fortunately for them, a legal and political framework for creating just such an army was already in place, forged years earlier by a clever and desperate political maneuver: the Oath of Tyndareus. To understand this oath, we must step back in time, to the years before Helen was married. Her earthly father, King Tyndareus of Sparta, faced a perilous political dilemma. Helen's unearthly beauty had attracted a host of suitors, not just young men, but powerful kings, princes, and heroes from every corner of the Achaean world. Each one came with his own army and his own ambitions. Tyndareus knew that to choose one man as Helen's husband would be to make enemies of all the others. He rightly feared that the announcement of a winner would trigger a catastrophic civil war, with the rejected suitors turning their swords against him and each other. The very prize they sought would be destroyed in the ensuing conflict. It was the cunning hero Odysseus of Ithaca who provided the solution. In exchange for Tyndareus' support in his own marital pursuits, Odysseus proposed a plan. Tyndareus would make every single suitor swear a solemn and binding oath. They had to swear not only to accept his final choice for Helen's husband, but to defend that marriage with their own military might against anyone who would ever try to disrupt it. Trapped by their own desire for Helen, and perhaps seeing the wisdom in preventing a war amongst themselves, every suitor agreed. They sacrificed a horse and swore the oath over its dismembered parts, a grim ritual that signified the fate that should befall any man who broke his word. Only after this oath was sworn did Tyndareus choose Menelaus to be Helen's husband. And for years, the oath lay dormant, a forgotten political guarantee. But with the flight of Helen and Paris, it was suddenly invoked. Menelaus's personal injury became the legal trigger for a pan-Hellenic military alliance. Agamemnon, acting as commander-in-chief, sent heralds across Greece calling upon every king and hero who had sworn that oath decades ago. They were now bound by their honor and their sacred vow to raise their armies and bring Helen back. The response was overwhelming. From all corners of Greece, the kings and their armies began to move, converging on the great coastal port of Aulis. This was the mustering of the 1,000 ships of legend. It was a sight of breathtaking scale, a forest of masts choking the bay, the shores teeming with tens of thousands of soldiers, the air filled with the sounds of blacksmiths' hammers and the shouts of commanders. Great heroes of the age arrived with their contingents. The brilliant Odysseus, the giant warrior Ajax, the wise old Nestor, the valiant Diomedes, all gathered under the supreme command of Agamemnon, ready to launch the greatest amphibious invasion in the history of their world. But the gods, whose whims had started this conflict, were not yet finished with their meddling. As the fleet prepared to depart, the winds died. The sea at Aulis became unnaturally calm, the sails of 1,000 ships hanging limp and useless. Day after day, the army waited, its morale beginning to fray. It became clear this was no natural phenomenon. The army's seer, a man named Calchas, declared that this was the work of Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the wilderness. Agamemnon, on a previous hunting trip, had boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself, a foolish act of hubris. Now she demanded payment for the insult. The price she demanded was unspeakable. Calchas revealed the goddess's will. For the winds to turn and for the fleet to sail, Agamemnon must sacrifice his own eldest daughter, Iphigenia. The prophecy threw the Greek camp into turmoil and plunged Agamemnon into an agonizing dilemma. He was trapped between his sacred duty as a father and his sworn duty as a commander. To refuse was to accept failure. The army would disband, and his name would be a byword for impotence and disgrace. To accept was to commit an act so monstrous it would haunt him forever and surely bring the wrath of his family down upon him. For a time he agonized, but the pressure from the other commanders and the grumbling of the vast, idle army was immense. His ambition and his duty to the campaign won out over his love for his daughter. In a heart-wrenching act of deception, he sent word for Iphigenia to come to Aulis, telling his wife Clytemnestra that their daughter was to be married to the great hero Achilles. Iphigenia arrived dressed for a wedding, only to be led to a sacrificial altar. In the most tragic and terrible moment of the entire campaign, a father took the life of his own child to advance the cause of the war. With the sacrifice complete, the anger of Artemis was appeased. A steady wind rose from the shore, filling the sails of the waiting fleet. The price for war had been paid in the most innocent of blood. The path was now clear, and there was no turning back. The 1,000 ships, united by a sacred oath and now a shared, terrible crime, finally set their course for the distant shores of Troy. The fleet is now at sea, 1,000 ships cutting through the Aegean, bound for vengeance. The epic narrative has begun. But before we follow them to the beaches of Troy, we must pause. Let us pull back from the myth, from the world of offended gods and sworn oaths, and anchor our story in the world that archaeologists have unearthed, the world of the late Bronze Age. The traditional date for the Trojan War is around the 13th century BCE, or the 1200s. And what we find in this period is not a vague landscape of myth, but a complex, vibrant, and surprisingly interconnected international community. The heroes we call the Greeks, or the Achaeans, as Homer names them, were part of a civilization we now refer to as the Mycenaean. This was not a single, unified kingdom of Greece. Rather, it was a network of powerful palatial states, each ruled by a warrior king, or one-axe, from a heavily fortified citadel. Think of great centres like Mycenae, with its immense Cyclopean walls and iconic Lion Gate, the sandy shores of Pylos, home of the wise King Nestor, or the powerful city of Thebes. These were sophisticated, bureaucratic states with a warrior aristocracy, a taste for luxury goods, and a writing system known as Linear B. They were a formidable military and maritime power in the Aegean, but they were not the only superpower in the region. To the east, dominating the vast peninsula of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, was the mighty Hittite Empire. With their capital at the sprawling city of Hattusa, the Hittites were a major force in the ancient Near East, a contemporary and rival to the new kingdom of Egypt. They were masters of diplomacy and warfare, famous for their use of chariots and their vast archives of clay tablets that give us incredible insight into the politics of the age. Any large-scale military conflict on the western coast of Anatolia, where Troy was located, would almost certainly have drawn the attention of the Hittites. The interconnectedness of this world is breathtaking. We see it clearly in diplomatic records, like the famous Amarna letters found in Egypt, clay tablets that reveal a web of correspondence between the pharaoh and the other great kings of the Hittites, Babylon, and Assyria. These letters even speak of a powerful kingdom to the west called Ahiawa, which most scholars now identify with the Mycenaean Greeks. This was an age of international diplomacy. The proof is not only in texts, but in the sea itself. The stunning discovery of the Uluburun shipwreck off the coast of Turkey, dated to the late 14th century BCE, revealed a single cargo hold filled with raw copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, ebony from Egypt, glass from Mesopotamia, and pottery from Mycenaean Greece. This was a globalized world, bound by intricate trade routes, and like any such world, it was ripe for competition and conflict. And what of Troy itself? For centuries, it was believed to be a city of pure myth. But in the 1870s, the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann began excavating a large mound in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlık. What he and subsequent archaeologists discovered was not one city, but at least 9 major cities, built one on top of the other over millennia. The location is strategically perfect, commanding the Dardanelles Strait, the crucial waterway that, to this day, connects the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. The archaeological layer known as Troy VI was a magnificent city, with powerful sloping walls and great towers, flourishing in the late Bronze Age. It was clearly a place of immense importance and wealth, a prime candidate for the city of Priam. Crucially, this city shows clear evidence of violent destruction, likely from an earthquake, around 1300 BCE. It was immediately rebuilt as the city of Troy Beta. This city, Troy Zephanta, was different. The grand houses were subdivided into smaller dwellings, large storage jars were sunk into the floors, and the fortifications were strengthened. It looks like a city preparing for, or recovering from, a crisis. A city crammed with people, stockpiling resources, bracing for a siege. And this city, Troy the Sevener, also met a fiery end. Archaeological evidence shows it was destroyed by a massive fire around 1180 BCE, a date which aligns remarkably well with the legendary timing of the Trojan War. We even find bronze arrowheads, some of them of a Mycenaean type, embedded in the walls. This evidence does not prove that the Iliad is literal history. It does not prove the existence of Helen or Achilles, but it does prove that a major fortified city, which we can confidently call Troy, existed in the right place at the right time. It proves that this city was destroyed by warfare in a manner consistent with the legend. The myth of a war for a beautiful queen may well be a poetic retelling of a more mundane but equally brutal historical reality. A conflict between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Trojans for control of rich trade routes, strategic territory, and valuable resources. A very real Trojan War. So, as our 1,000 ships finally approach the shores of Troy, remember that the stage for this epic conflict is not a fantasy land. It is a real place within a volatile and complex geopolitical landscape, where the ambitions of kings and the wealth of nations were prizes worth fighting and dying for. After a journey across the Aegean, the great Achaean armada finally arrived at the shores of the Troad, the land ruled by the city of Troy. The sight that greeted the Trojans was terrifying. 1,000 black ships disgorging tens of thousands of warriors onto their beaches. The landing itself was not easy. The Trojans, forewarned of the invasion, fiercely contested the beachhead. The first Greek to leap ashore, a hero named Patroclus, was famously the first to die, cut down by Trojan spears, a grim omen for the long and bloody decade that was to come. But the sheer weight of the Mycenaean numbers was unstoppable. They fought their way onto the land, established a fortified camp, and dragged their ships safely onto the beach. The Achaean army had arrived. But the city of Troy was no easy prize. The massive walls that archaeologists have unearthed at Hisarlık were just as formidable as the legends claimed. The Greeks could not storm them, and the Trojans, though brave, were not foolish enough to risk their entire army in a single, pitched battle against the superior numbers of the Achaean host. And so, the conflict quickly devolved into a brutal and demoralizing stalemate. The war became a siege, but a strange and porous one. Troy was not fully cut off. It could still receive supplies and allies from the inland territories of Anatolia. The Greeks, in turn, could not sustain their massive army solely from supplies brought by sea. So the first 9 years of the Trojan War were not a period of grand, heroic duels before the city gates. Instead, it was a long and grinding war of attrition. The Achaean forces spent much of their time conducting raids on Troy's allies and neighbours, sacking smaller towns and cities up and down the coast to seize supplies, treasure, and grimly, women to serve as slaves and war prizes in the Greek camp. These raids were essential for the war effort, but they also sowed dissent and conflict within the Achaean ranks, particularly when it came time to divide the spoils. For 9 years, the conflict festered. Heroes died in nameless skirmishes, soldiers grew weary of the endless waiting, and frustration mounted on both sides. It is in this 10th and final year that Homer's Iliad begins, and it is here that we meet the champions whose fates will define the war. At the head of the Achaean forces was Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. As the overall commander, he possessed immense authority, but his leadership was deeply flawed. He was proud, stubborn, and often driven by greed, a combination of traits that made him a powerful king, but a poor diplomat, prone to making disastrous decisions that would alienate his most valuable soldiers. Fighting under his command was the hero Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca. Odysseus was not the strongest or fastest of the Greek heroes, but he was by far the most intelligent. He was a master strategist, a silver-tongued orator, and a pragmatist who understood the darker arts of warfare, from deception to espionage. While others relied on brute force, Odysseus relied on his mind, a trait that would ultimately prove decisive. But the greatest warrior in the Achaean camp, and indeed the world, was Achilles. The son of the sea nymph Thetis, he was a demigod of breathtaking speed and skill, virtually invincible in battle. He was the ultimate warrior, but he was also driven by a burning need for glory and a volatile, all-consuming pride. Achilles fought not for Agamemnon, nor even for the return of Helen, but for his own immortal fame. His wrath, as we shall see, would prove more devastating to the Greek cause than any Trojan weapon. Within the walls of Troy, the defenders were led by the noble royal house of Priam. King Priam himself was an old man, respected and beloved, but too old to fight. He was forced to watch the war from the ramparts, presiding over a city in crisis and a family that was both its greatest defense and the cause of its ruin. His son, Paris, the man who had started the war, was a constant source of conflict. Though a capable archer, he was often seen as effeminate and cowardly, more interested in the comforts of the bedchamber with Helen than in fighting on the front lines. His actions were a source of shame for the Trojans and a constant goad to his more heroic brother. That brother was Hector, the eldest son of Priam and the undisputed commander of the Trojan army. Hector was everything Paris was not. He was a devoted husband and father, a dutiful son, and a courageous warrior who commanded the absolute loyalty of his men. Hector did not fight for glory or for passion, but for the defense of his family, his people, and his beloved city. He was the shield of Troy, the one man who stood between the Achaean army and the destruction of his home. These are the men whose choices and passions will dominate the final, bloody year of this decade-long war. The war had been a stalemate for 9 long years, but in the 10th year, the chain of events that would lead to its bloody climax was set in motion not by a Trojan spear, but by the arrogance of the Achaean commander. A mysterious plague swept through the Greek camp, felling soldier after soldier. The funeral pyres burned day and night. It was a divine attack, and the reason for it was Agamemnon. A priest of Apollo named Chryses had come to the Greek camp to ransom his daughter, Chryseis, who had been captured in a raid and assigned to Agamemnon as his war prize. Agamemnon, in his hubris, cruelly rejected the old priest and sent him away with threats. In his grief, Chryseis prayed to Apollo, who answered by loosing his plague arrows upon the Achaean army. It was Achilles who finally took action. He called an assembly and demanded that the seer Calchas reveal the cause of the plague. With a promise of protection from Achilles, Calchas declared that the plague was Apollo's punishment and would only cease if Chryseis was returned to her father. Under pressure from the entire army, Agamemnon furiously agreed. But his wounded pride demanded compensation. If he was to give up his prize, he declared, he would take the prize of another hero to replace it, to reassert his authority and maintain his status. And the prize he chose to seize belonged to Achilles. Here, we must understand the warrior code of the heroic age. A hero's value was measured by his time, a concept that translates to honor, respect, and prestige. This was not just an abstract feeling. It was represented by the tangible spoils of war. The finest armor, the most treasure, and the most prized women captured in raids were all physical manifestations of a hero's time. They were proof of his prowess and his worth. For Agamemnon to seize Achilles' prize, a captive woman named Briseis, was not a simple transaction. It was a public and calculated act of degradation. It was a declaration in front of the entire army that Achilles, for all his divine heritage and battlefield supremacy, was a lesser man, subordinate to the king's authority. The reaction was explosive. Achilles, his pride incinerated, unleashed a torrent of rage upon Agamemnon, accusing him of being a greedy, cowardly king who hid behind the front lines while better men did the fighting. He was on the verge of drawing his sword and killing the commander on the spot, an act that would have shattered the Achaean cause forever. He was stopped only by the goddess Athena, who appeared to him alone, urging him to check his rage and fight with words, not weapons, promising him that his honor would be repaid threefold in the future. Achilles relented, but his compliance had its limits. He declared that he and his elite warriors, the Myrmidons, would no longer fight for Agamemnon. He would sit by his ships and watch as Agamemnon's arrogance led the army to ruin. This was the beginning of the wrath of Achilles, the central theme of the Iliad. It was a withdrawal rooted in a profound question. If a hero's honor can be stripped away at the whim of a lesser man, then why fight at all? What is the point of seeking glory if its rewards are not secure? His quest for glory, or kleos, was the very reason Achilles was at Troy. A prophecy had foretold that he had two possible fates. He could return home and live a long, happy, and anonymous life, or he could stay and fight at Troy, where he would win immortal fame but die a young man. By choosing to be here, he had chosen kleos over life itself. Agamemnon's insult was an attack on the very foundation of that choice. Sullen and enraged, Achilles retreated to the shoreline and prayed to his goddess mother, Thetis. He asked her to petition Zeus, the king of the gods, to grant victory to the Trojans until the Achaeans were so thoroughly beaten that they would be forced to recognize his worth and beg him to return. Thetis, rising from the sea, carried her son's bitter request to Olympus, and Zeus, honoring an old debt to Thetis, agreed. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. With Achilles and his Myrmidons out of the fight, the tide of the war turned dramatically. Hector, now unburdened by the threat of Achilles, led the Trojan army in a series of devastating assaults. The Achaeans, who had so recently been the besiegers, now found themselves besieged. They were pushed back from the plains, their defensive wall was breached, and the Trojans brought the battle right to the edge of their ships, threatening to set the entire fleet ablaze and trap the Greeks against the sea. The heroes who had seemed so mighty just days before were now routed and terrified. Seeing the disaster he had wrought, Agamemnon fell into despair. He admitted his folly and assembled a delegation to go to Achilles. Led by Odysseus, they went to Achilles' tent and offered him a fortune in restitution. The return of Briseis untouched, vast quantities of gold, tripods, horses, and even one of Agamemnon's own daughters in marriage. It was an offer of immense value, designed to restore Achilles' time many times over. But Achilles, his heart hardened by his all-consuming rage, refused it all. His speech was a bitter rejection of the entire heroic code as practiced by Agamemnon. His honor, he declared, was not something that could be bought and sold. The wound was too deep. The Achaean army was left to its fate on the very brink of annihilation. To understand the Trojan War as the ancient Greeks did, we must understand that it was fought on two fronts simultaneously. The first was the dusty, blood-soaked plain before the walls of Troy, where mortals fought and died. The second was the ethereal realm of Mount Olympus, where the immortal gods schemed, argued, and intervened with impunity. The war was their grand game, the mortal heroes their favourite players, and the battlefield their chessboard. Their interference was not random. It was driven by personal slights, family loyalties, and ancient rivalries. The divine alliances were forged long before the first spear was thrown, decided in that fateful moment of the judgment of Paris. On the side of the Achaeans were two of the most powerful goddesses on Olympus, Hera, queen of the gods, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. Still nursing their wounded pride after being slighted by the Trojan prince Paris, their support for the Greek cause was relentless and unforgiving. They were joined by Poseidon, the god of the sea, who held an ancient grudge against Troy after its former king had cheated him out of payment for building the city's magnificent walls. Supporting the Trojans was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who was honor-bound to protect her chosen champion, Paris. She was aided by her lover, Ares, the volatile and bloodthirsty god of war, who revelled in the chaos of battle. And most formidable of all was Apollo, the archer god, who held a deep affection for the Trojans and whose power could bring victory in battle or plague upon an entire army. Presiding over this divine civil war was Zeus, the king of the gods. His position was complex. While his wife Hera pushed relentlessly for a Greek victory, Zeus himself felt an affection for the noble Hector and the pious Trojans. More importantly, he was bound by his promise to the sea nymph Thetis to grant the Trojans success until the honor of her son, Achilles, was restored. He acts as the arbiter of the conflict, attempting to balance the scales and manage the petty squabbles of his divine family, all while ensuring that the larger arc of capital F fate unfolds as it must. The gods' interventions were constant and direct. They would shroud their favourites in mist to whisk them away from a fatal blow, as Aphrodite did for Paris when he was soundly defeated in a duel by Menelaus. They would deflect spears, mend wounds, and breathe supernatural courage and strength, a force called Menos, into their chosen warriors. In one of the most remarkable episodes of the Iliad, the Greek hero Diomedes is so empowered by Athena that he goes on a divine rampage. He is given the ability to see the gods on the battlefield, and with Athena's encouragement, he succeeds in wounding two of them. First Aphrodite, and then even the great war god Ares himself, who flees the battlefield bellowing in pain and complains to Zeus like a petulant child. This shows that the barrier between mortal and immortal was surprisingly thin. The gods were not distant, abstract beings. They were tangible forces on the battlefield, and their behavior was often anything but divine. They were driven by narcissism, jealousy, and spite. They schemed against each other ceaselessly. In one famous passage, Hera devises an elaborate plot to aid the Greeks against Zeus's command. She adorns herself with irresistible beauty, borrows an enchanted girdle from Aphrodite, and proceeds to seduce her husband. After they make love, Zeus falls into a deep, magical sleep, allowing Hera and Poseidon to intervene freely on the Achaeans' behalf, rallying the troops and turning the tide of battle until Zeus finally awakens in a rage. Yet, for all their power, even the gods were not omnipotent. They were often constrained by a higher power, destiny itself. Zeus, for all his authority, watches the battle knowing that his own mortal son, the hero Sarpedon, is fated to be killed. He weeps tears of blood and considers intervening to save him. But Hera reminds him that if he saves his own child from a fated death, then every other god will want to do the same for their favourites, and the entire cosmic order will unravel. With great sorrow, Zeus allows fate to run its course, demonstrating that even the king of the gods is a servant to a power greater than himself. This constant meddling presence of the gods created a battlefield environment of pure chaos. No victory was secure, no hero was safe. A warrior could be on the brink of triumph only to see his enemy vanish in a divine mist. An army could be charging forward with unstoppable momentum, only to be thrown into a panic by a terrifying shout from an opposing god. It is this chaotic and desperate environment, shaped by the whims of these all-too-human gods, that sets the stage for the next tragic act in our mortal drama. The Achaean army was broken, pushed back against their own ships, with the Trojans led by a relentless Hector setting fire to the fleet. Their annihilation seemed imminent. From his vantage point on the shore, Achilles watched the disaster he had enabled unfold, his heart still hardened by his grudge. But there was one person in the Greek camp for whom the suffering of his comrades outweighed even the stubborn pride of Achilles, Patroclus. He was Achilles' closest and most beloved companion, his childhood friend and brother in arms. Seeing the carnage, Patroclus went to Achilles, his face streaked with tears, and begged him to relent. Achilles, still unwilling to fight for Agamemnon himself, refused. But Patroclus, in his desperation, made an alternative proposal. If Achilles would not fight, then let him, Patroclus, borrow his divine armour and lead his fresh troops, the Myrmidons, into battle. The sight of Achilles' famous armour, he argued, would terrify the Trojans and give the exhausted Achaeans a desperately needed moment of respite. Achilles, moved by his friend's plea, and perhaps seeing a way to aid his comrades without swallowing his own pride, agreed. But he gave Patroclus a strict and fatal warning: push the Trojans back from the ships, but go no further. Do not, under any circumstances, get drawn into an assault on the city of Troy itself. Patroclus donned the legendary armour. For a moment, he looked like Achilles reborn. He mounted the hero's chariot and led the Myrmidons in a thunderous charge into the fray. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Trojans, believing the great Achilles had returned to the battle, were struck with terror. Their advance faltered. They broke ranks and began to fall back in disarray. Patroclus fought like a man possessed, a whirlwind of destruction at the head of the army, cutting down Trojan after Trojan and single-handedly turning the tide of the entire war. He successfully drove the Trojans back from the ships, saving the fleet from destruction. But here, in the intoxicating rush of his own success, Patroclus made his fatal error. He forgot Achilles' warning. Filled with the warrior lust of the moment, he ignored the order to halt and instead led the charge across the plain, pursuing the fleeing Trojans all the way to the walls of Troy itself. He was magnificent, but he had gone too far. He was a mortal wearing a demigod's armour, flying too close to the sun. And the gods had taken notice. As Patroclus attempted to scale the walls of the city, he was met by the god Apollo. The god struck him squarely on the back, knocking his helmet off and shattering his spear. Dazed and disarmed, Patroclus was then wounded by a Trojan spear from behind. He was now helpless, stumbling amongst the chaos of the front lines. It was then that he came face to face with Hector. The Trojan hero, seeing his dazed and wounded opponent, did not hesitate. He drove his spear into Patroclus's belly, delivering the mortal blow. As Patroclus lay dying, Hector stripped him of the divine armour of Achilles, a supreme trophy taken on the battlefield. The news of his friend's death reached Achilles like a tidal wave. His reaction was terrifying in its intensity. He let out a cry of such profound grief and despair that his mother, Thetis, heard it from the depths of the sea. He poured dust and ashes over his head, defiling himself, rolling on the ground in a primal agony that went far beyond mere sadness. His rage against Agamemnon vanished, instantly replaced by an all-consuming suicidal grief, and then by a cold, murderous desire for revenge. The war was no longer about honour or prizes. It was now a personal vendetta. He would kill Hector. He knew that the prophecy foretold his own death would follow soon after Hector's, but in that moment, he did not care. His own life was meaningless without his companion. He formally reconciled with Agamemnon, declaring his wrath at an end, caring nothing for the gifts that were now lavished upon him. But he could not fight. His armour was now worn by Hector. His mother, Thetis, went to Hephaestus, the smith god, and begged him to forge a new set of armour for her son. Hephaestus agreed, creating a masterpiece of divine craftsmanship, a shield, in particular, that depicted the entire world in miniature with scenes of peace and war, of cities and harvests. The next morning, Achilles donned his new divine armour. He was no longer the sulking hero on the beach. He was transformed into a terrifying instrument of death, an inhuman force fueled by grief and rage. He mounted his chariot and let out a war cry that chilled the blood of every soldier, Greek and Trojan alike. The wrath of Achilles was over, but something far more terrible had just been unleashed upon the world. The return of Achilles to the battlefield was not a turning of the tide. It was a tsunami of destruction. Consumed by grief and clad in God-forged armour, he was an unstoppable force of nature. He stormed into the Trojan ranks, and the terrified Trojans broke before him, scattering like sheep before a wolf. He was not interested in taking prisoners or winning the war. His focus was singular and absolute. He was hunting for Hector. In his rage, he even battled the river god Scamander, whose waters became so choked with the bodies of men that the river itself rose up to fight him. But nothing could stand in his way. The chaos drove the remaining Trojan army back in a panic through the city's Scaean gate. All except one. Hector, knowing this was his final duty as the city's protector, stood alone outside the walls, waiting to face the man who was now more god than mortal. For a moment, even Hector's courage failed him. As Achilles charged, the Trojan hero turned and fled, and the two greatest warriors of the age chased each other 3 times around the great walls of Troy. But Hector knew he could not outrun his fate. He stopped, turned, and stood his ground. The duel was swift and terrible. Hector fought with courage, but he was no match for a warrior fueled by divine rage and protected by divine armour. Achilles, who knew the weak points of his own old armour, now worn by Hector, saw a small gap near the collarbone. He thrust his spear into that single vulnerable spot, and the shield of Troy fell. In his final moments, Hector begged Achilles to return his body to his parents for a proper burial, a plea to the most sacred traditions of honour. Achilles, his heart a stone of hatred, refused. He declared that he would rather eat Hector's flesh raw than grant him any honour, and promised that dogs and vultures would defile his corpse. What followed was one of the most shocking acts in the entire epic. In his madness, Achilles lashed Hector's body by the ankles to the back of his chariot and dragged his fallen enemy in the dust, circling the very walls his foe had died to protect, all in full view of Hector's grieving parents and wife. For days, Achilles continued to abuse the body, a profound violation of every code of war and human decency. It was only when the gods themselves intervened, with Zeus sending Thetis to command her son to relent, and Priam, guided by the god Hermes, bravely journeyed to the Greek camp to ransom his son's body, that Achilles' humanity finally returned. In a deeply moving scene, the two grieving men, the father who had lost his son and the warrior who had lost his dearest friend, wept together. Achilles released Hector's body, and a temporary truce was called for the funeral, but the death of Hector had sealed Troy's fate, and Achilles' own fate was close behind. As foretold, soon after his victory, he was killed. Fighting near the Scaean gate, a poisoned arrow shot by the cowardly prince Paris was guided by the god Apollo himself, striking Achilles in his one vulnerable spot, his heel. The greatest warrior of the Achaeans fell, and the war once again ground to a stalemate. The end came not with a bang, but with a trick. It is here we leave the Iliad, which ends with the funeral of Hector, and turn to other sources like Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid. It was the cunning Odysseus who devised the final, desperate gambit. The Achaeans built a colossal wooden horse and left it on the beach as a supposed offering to Athena. They then burned their camps and sailed away, but only as far as a nearby island, where they hid out of sight. The Trojans, seeing the Greeks had finally gone, rejoiced. A great debate ensued over what to do with the strange horse. Despite the dire warnings of the priest Laocoon and the prophetess Cassandra, the Trojans, in their deluded victory, chose to believe it was a sacred offering. They tore down a section of their own supposedly impregnable walls and dragged the instrument of their doom into the heart of their city. That night, Troy celebrated its victory with a wild, drunken festival. And as the city slept, a hidden door in the horse opened. Odysseus and a handful of elite warriors climbed out, slaughtered the sentries, and opened the city gates. The Greek fleet, signalled by a beacon, had returned in the darkness. The sack of Troy was a night of unmitigated horror. The Achaean soldiers, filled with 10 years of pent-up rage, swarmed into the sleeping city and unleashed a massacre. They slaughtered without mercy men, women, and children. King Priam was cut down at his own household altar. The Trojan women were rounded up to be taken as slaves. The Greeks committed terrible acts of sacrilege, desecrating temples and murdering those who sought sanctuary. The city that had stood for centuries, that had withstood a 10-year siege, was utterly destroyed in a single night of fire and blood, its riches plundered and its people eradicated. The Great War was finally over. The city of Troy was a smoking ruin. The war was over, and the Achaeans were, by any measure, victorious. After 10 years of brutal warfare, they had accomplished their goal. But victory and peace are not the same thing. In the savage sack of the city, the Greeks had committed unspeakable acts of cruelty and sacrilege, murdering priests at their altars and desecrating the temples of the gods. Their triumph was soured by a hubris that the heavens could not ignore. The gods who had once been their allies now turned against them. For the surviving heroes of the Trojan War, the journey home would become an ordeal as harrowing as the war itself. These tales of their bitter homecomings are known as the nostoi. The gods' anger manifested almost immediately. As the victorious Achaean fleet set sail for home, a great storm, sent by Athena and Poseidon, fell upon them. The fleet was smashed and scattered across the unfamiliar seas. Many ships were wrecked, and many heroes who had survived a decade of combat drowned within sight of their prize. For those who did survive the storm, the fates that awaited them at home were often just as cruel. The most shocking and tragic homecoming was that of the commander himself, King Agamemnon. After a difficult journey, he returned to his palace in Mycenae, a triumphant hero, the conqueror of Troy. He was welcomed by his wife, Queen Clytemnestra, who laid out purple tapestries for him to walk on, an honour fit for a god and a subtle trap for his hubris. But her welcome was a mask. For the 10 years Agamemnon had been away, she had been nursing a cold and bitter hatred. She had never forgiven him for the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia at Aulis. While he was away, she had taken a new lover, Aegisthus, Agamemnon's own cousin. Together, they plotted their revenge. That evening, as the victorious king was in his bath, unarmed and vulnerable, they murdered him. The great commander who had survived 10 years of war was killed not by an enemy hero, but by his own wife in his own home. His victory was utterly hollow, and his death was the grim payment for the crime that had allowed his expedition to begin. An equally terrible, though far more prolonged fate awaited the war's greatest strategist, Odysseus. While Agamemnon's journey home was swift and fatal, Odysseus's return became a 10-year epic of suffering in itself, a story immortalized in its own epic, the Odyssey. His cunning had won the war, but it had also earned him powerful enemies among the gods. His role in the sack of Troy had offended Athena, and his blinding of the Cyclops Polyphemus brought upon him the unrelenting wrath of the Cyclops' father, Poseidon, god of the sea. For 10 years, Poseidon tormented Odysseus, ensuring he would never reach his home in Ithaca. He was blown off course, shipwrecked, and washed ashore on strange, magical islands inhabited by monsters and sorceresses. He lost all of his ships and every single one of his men. His journey became a trial, a process of being stripped of his companions, his wealth, and his heroic pride, until he was nothing but a naked, broken survivor. The man whose mind had conquered Troy was forced to wander the world, his name a memory, his wife and son besieged by suitors in his own home, The fates of Agamemnon and Odysseus are the most famous of the Nostoi, but the theme was the same for nearly all the surviving Greek heroes. Their victory was a curse. They had spent a decade fighting for a home that, for many, no longer existed or no longer wanted them. The violence and brutality they had unleashed upon Troy followed them back across the sea, infecting their families and their kingdoms, leading to more betrayal, more murder, and more suffering. They had won the war, but in doing so, they had lost themselves. The mythological world of the Greek heroes ends in ruin. Troy is a smoking heap of rubble. The victorious heroes are scattered, cursed, and murdered in their own homes. The entire heroic society that fought the war effectively ceases to exist. Is it merely a coincidence that this narrative of total societal collapse aligns so perfectly with what archaeologists and historians have discovered in the geologic and historical record? For at the same time as our myth, around the year 1200 BCE, the real-world civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean was also experiencing a violent and mysterious collapse. This event is known today as the Late Bronze Age collapse. It was a cataclysm that was far more widespread and consequential than a single siege. Across Greece and the Near East, the great palatial centres that had flourished for centuries were systematically destroyed. The Mycenaean citadels of Mycenae and Pylos were burned and abandoned. The mighty Hittite Empire in Anatolia, which had rivaled Egypt, vanished completely. Great trading cities in the Levant were levelled. The international trade network that the Uluburan shipwreck so vividly illustrated simply disintegrated. So profound was the collapse that the art of writing itself was lost in Greece for hundreds of years, ushering in a period we now call the Greek Dark Ages. For decades, historians have debated the cause of this catastrophe. Ancient Egyptian records speak of an onslaught of mysterious invaders from the sea, whom they called the Sea Peoples. These enigmatic marauders are depicted in inscriptions as a coalition of peoples who swept down from the north, destroying everything in their path before finally being stopped at the borders of Egypt. For a long time, these Sea Peoples were seen as the primary cause of the collapse. However, modern scholarship increasingly views their raids not as the cause, but as a symptom of a much larger systems collapse. The evidence now points to a convergence of multiple, devastating stresses that hit the region at the same time. Widespread, severe droughts led to famine and mass migrations. This likely caused internal rebellions, as starving peasant populations rose up against the ruling palace elite. The disruption of one part of the international trade network would have caused cascading failures elsewhere, much like a modern global economic crisis. It was a perfect storm of climate change, famine, warfare, and revolution that brought an entire world order crashing down. So, what is the connection to the Trojan War? It is entirely possible that the epic story of a 10-year war against a great foreign city is, in fact, a powerful cultural memory of this entire chaotic era. It is how a later culture, living in the Dark Age that followed, made sense of the bewildering collapse of their ancestors' magnificent world. Instead of trying to recall 100 different famines, raids, and rebellions, the story was simplified and condensed. All the anxiety, all the violence, all the trauma of a civilizational death was focused into one single, epic and understandable narrative: a great war against a great enemy. The legend of Troy provided a face for the chaos, and the stories of the Nostoi, the cursed homecomings, provided a mythic explanation for a stark reality. For the generation of men who went out to fight in this period, there were often no homes left to return to. Their palaces had been burned and their kingdoms had vanished in their absence. The story of the Trojan War, therefore, may be the most brilliant kind of historical monument, one that preserves the emotional truth of an era by transforming a messy and complex reality into a timeless and unforgettable story of heroism, tragedy, and loss. The great empires of the Bronze Age fell. The Mycenaean palaces and the citadel of Troy crumbled into ruin, their treasures looted and their people scattered. The Linear B script was forgotten, and the memory of the great kings faded into the dust. But something proved more durable than stone walls or bronze armor: the story. Out of the ashes of the collapse and the ensuing Dark Age, the tale of the Trojan War survived, passed down through generations of oral poets, until it was finally crystallized into the forms we know today, the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. For the ancient Greeks, these poems were everything. They were the foundational texts of their civilization, their equivalent of a sacred scripture and a national history rolled into one. Young Greek boys learnt to read by studying the exploits of Achilles and Odysseus. The poems provided a shared pantheon of heroes, a common set of values, and a definitive moral landscape. They explored the concepts of honor, glory, piety, and the complex relationship between mortals and the divine. The Trojan War was the central, defining event of their ancestral past, a story that gave them a powerful sense of who they were. But the legacy of Troy was not confined to Greece. As the Greek city-states waned, a new power was rising in Italy. The Romans, as they built their empire, looked to the great culture of the Greeks and sought to connect themselves to that same heroic past. They found their link in a minor Trojan hero who escaped the city's destruction, Aeneas. In one of the most powerful foundation myths ever conceived, Aeneas is depicted fleeing the burning city, carrying his elderly father, Anchises, on his shoulders and leading his young son, Ascanius, by the hand. This image of pietas, of duty to one's family, gods, and country, became a cornerstone of Roman virtue. The Roman poet Virgil, writing under the patronage of the first emperor, Augustus, took this legend and crafted the Aeneid, a national epic deliberately designed to rival Homer. It tells the story of Aeneas's long, fated journey from the ruins of Troy to the shores of Italy, where his descendants would one day found the city of Rome. With this single story, Rome gave itself a heroic, ancient lineage, positioning itself not as a destroyer of Greek culture, but as the noble successor to the legacy of Troy. Through Greece and Rome, the story of the Trojan War became deeply embedded in the DNA of Western civilization. Its characters became archetypes, shorthand for timeless human traits: the rage of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, the nobility of Hector, the tragic beauty of Helen. The story has been retold and reinterpreted by countless artists, poets, and playwrights, from Euripides in the 5th century BCE to Shakespeare in the 17th century, each generation finding its own meanings in the ancient tale of war and loss. It is a story so powerful that it has lent its language to our own, from a Trojan horse that signifies a hidden threat to an Achilles heel that denotes a fatal weakness. The ultimate legacy of Troy, then, is not one of historical fact, but of narrative power. The story has survived for 3 millennia, not because of its historical accuracy, but because it deals with the most fundamental and enduring themes of the human condition: the brutal nature of war, the conflict between personal passion and public duty, the struggle for glory, and the profound sorrow of loss. It is a story that has served as a mirror for humanity, reflecting our own heroism and our own folly back at us across the ages. Our journey is now at an end, but the question remains: was the Trojan War real? The question itself may be flawed. The search for a single, provable historical event that matches the Iliad is likely a fool's errand. The true power of the Trojan War, the reason it has endured, lies not in its factuality, but precisely in this fusion of memory and myth. The story is a testament to how human culture processes trauma. A messy, complex period of famine, migration, and systemic collapse was perhaps too chaotic to be remembered as it was. Instead, it was condensed, amplified, and given a face, a narrative, and a moral. The story of Troy may not be a literal history, but it is a powerful truth, a poetic echo of a lost world. And this is why we still return to it 3 millennia later. Why do we still feel the sting of Achilles' pride, the sorrow of Priam's grief, the desperation of the Achaean soldiers so far from home? Because the story speaks to timeless and universal aspects of the human condition. It is a story about the devastating consequences of a single, flawed choice. It is a profound meditation on the nature of warfare, its intoxicating glory and its soul-crushing brutality. It explores the conflict that lives within all of us, the struggle between our personal desires and our public duties, between our capacity for love and our capacity for hatred. The Trojan War is more than a story about a Bronze Age conflict. It's a story about the loss of a golden age, the struggle to find our way home, and the search for meaning in a world that often seems governed by chaotic and indifferent forces. The empires and heroes of the Bronze Age are long gone, their walls have crumbled, and their languages are silent. But the story they inspired proved more durable than any fortress, and more powerful than any king. It has survived because we need it to. We need it to remind us of the heights of human nobility and the depths of our own folly, and of the incredible power of a story to transform the chaos of history into a legacy that can never truly die. And now I turn the question to you. Which character or event from the Trojan War do you find most compelling, and why? Share your perspective in the comments section below. If you enjoy this in-depth format and wish to see more, your like and subscription are the most direct way to support our work here at Ancient History Concepts. Thanks for watching.